The following story isn't urban legend. It isn't entertainment. This is one of those true horror stories that get posted to Reddit, then vanish not because they're fake, but because they're too real. Michael Grant had never been to Nevada before. He just needed one night's rest before heading deeper into the desert. When he checked into the small roadside hotel, the receptionist looked half asleep and handed him a room key. "Room 6, she mumbled. He noticed something strange. The hallway only listed rooms 1 through 5 and 7 through 12. "Is there a mistake?" he asked. The receptionist froze. We don't have a room 6, but the key in his hand said otherwise. He walked down the hallway anyway, and there it was, a door with a tarnished brass 6 nailed on, flickering under the dying hallway light. When he opened it, what waited on the other side wasn't a hotel room. It was a place that remembered him before he arrived, a place that did not obey time, or space, or sanity. This isn't just another scary story. This is one of the true creepy stories the internet tries to bury, hidden in corners of stories from Reddit, and threads tagged "Don't open the door" on "Let's not meet." But some doors, they open themselves. Michael stood in front of the door labeled 6. The hallway behind him flickered, a cold fluorescent tube buzzing above his head, bathing the air in an anemic blue glow. The air smelled like old air conditioners and something else, something faintly metallic. His fingers closed around the key. It was ice cold. The receptionist's words still echoed in his head. "We don't have a room 6. And yet, here it was. He unlocked the door. The click was soft, almost mechanical, the kind of sound you don't hear as much as feel in the teeth. He turned the knob, opened it, and stepped into a world that was not the hotel. No furniture, no bed, no lamps. Just a narrow hallway stretching forward impossibly long, lined with warped antique wallpaper that pulsed slightly like breathing skin. Behind him, the hotel hallway was gone. No door, no light, just the hallway ahead. Michael called out, "Hello," no echo, no response, just silence. The kind that pressed against your eardrums. He took a step, then another. The floor felt like wood, but every few feet it shifted. Carpet, stone, dirt. The walls too changed as he moved. From floral prints to forest bark to rusted steel. It was like walking through memories that weren't yours. He reached a bend and turned. There, hanging in the air, was a photo frame, just floating. He stepped closer. It was a black and white picture of himself, standing in this hallway. Behind him, something in the shadows. Smiling, Michael stumbled backward, heart racing. He dropped the photo. It vanished before it hit the ground. Then the lights overhead dimmed one by one. A soft whisper floated down the corridor. "You remember too much." He ran, or tried to. The hallway shifted beneath him, bending in impossible angles. He passed a door labeled room 7, then another room 3, then room 6 again. He stopped, opened it. Inside, a fully furnished hotel room. Bed, lamp, nightstand. Finally, something familiar. But as he stepped in, the door slammed shut behind him, and the walls began to breathe. Michael clutched his head. He whispered, "This isn't real." But it felt real. Too real. On the desk lay a notebook. Its title, "True Horror Stories, Guests Who Remember." He opened it. Inside were handwritten stories, each entry dated, each one titled with a room number. Each one ended with the same words, "Never open a door that doesn't exist." One entry stood out. Room 6. "I stayed here in 1972. The front desk swore the room wasn't real. I entered anyway. Found versions of myself, some younger, some dead. Every time I blinked, they changed places. I'm still here. Please, don't read this out loud." Michael slammed the book shut. When he looked up, the mirror above the desk no longer reflected him. It showed the hallway again, and a shadow approaching. He turned to run, but the door had vanished. The bed twisted inward. The lamp was melting. The carpet peeled itself back to reveal woodland soil, and beneath that, fur. Thousands of strands of gray fur, soft, fresh. Michael screamed, and the walls answered, not with sound, with memories. He was 7, lost in a shopping mall. He was 16, watching his grandfather die in a hospital bed. He was 24, ending a relationship he couldn't explain. He was now in a hotel room that didn't exist. Michael dropped to his knees. He whispered, "Why me?" And the air replied, "Because you tried to forget." A door opened behind him. Room 5. He didn't think. He ran through it and found himself outside, not in the parking lot, in a forest. The stars above didn't look right. Too many, too symmetrical. And the trees, they had no bark, only walls of old wallpaper peeking from underneath moss and blood. He had stumbled into a place he'd read about once on Reddit. In a thread called Creepy Outdoors, Stories That Don't Belong in National Parks. He remembered one line. Sometimes a hotel hallway spills into the woods. If you see a room key out of place, don't take it. Michael wandered the forest for what felt like hours. Each path looped, the trees began whispering stories, tales of guests who vanished after entering unlisted rooms. He heard fragments. I opened room 9 and woke up in 1953. Room 0 is the archive. Don't go there. I looked under the bed in room 4 and saw my funeral. Cats never enter the hallway. They know better. Michael clutched his head. These weren't dreams. They were true creepy stories, ones that never made it to the forums because the people who lived them never came back. He found a structure, a ranger station. No, it looked like one, but wrong. Twisted like it had been built by someone who'd never seen architecture before. Inside shelves of notebooks, each one labeled True Stories, Wilderness Memories, Scary Stories of the Rooms That Don't Exist. Michael flipped through one, found his name next to the word pending. Suddenly, a bell rang, the kind you hear at hotel front desks. Ding. He turned. A desk stood in the center of the room now, and behind it, the receptionist. Same face, same voice. "You shouldn't have opened that door," Michael asked. "What is this place?" The receptionist smiled, but her eyes remained dead. "This is what happens when you enter a story that wasn't yours." He backed away, but the floor opened, not like a trapdoor, like a memory collapsing. And he fell through forests, through mirrors, through room keys, through scary woods. Stories, creepy park ranger stories, wilderness stories, true horror stories. All connected. He saw them, all of them. Every person who ever opened the wrong door. They were still falling, still remembering, still trying to close doors that could no longer be closed. He landed in room 6 again. Same bed, same desk, same notebook, same words over and over. "You remember too much." Room 6 had swallowed him. Not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, chronologically. Michael wasn't sure how long he'd been inside. The clocks didn't work. The lamps pulsed like heartbeats. The wallpaper changed languages. At some point, he stopped keeping track of the shifting furniture and started watching his own thoughts change. The room was alive, and it remembered things he hadn't lived yet. He opened the drawer of the nightstand. Inside were dozens of room keys, each labeled with names. Sarah D., room 9, Oliver K., room 2, Unknown, room 0, Michael Grant, room 6. He picked up his own key. It was warm, the metal shimmered. Then he saw his reflection in the mirror across the room, but the reflection was younger, smiling. Behind the younger him was the corner, and in that corner, something blinked. Michael bolted from the room, but the hallway had shifted again. It was no longer linear, it looped. He passed the same faded vending machine 3 times, each time a different snack inside. First peanuts, second a single eyeball, third a blinking photo of himself trapped behind glass. He looked around, breathing heavy. "Let's not meet," he whispered to himself. "Let's not meet whatever made this place." The hallway ended in a spiral staircase which descended endlessly. He walked down for what felt like hours. Posters lined the walls, true stories from guests who vanished, each showing headlines from local papers. Man claims room didn't exist, then vanishes. Hotel receives letter from guest lost in time. Unexplained door appears in abandoned ranger cabin. Michael recognized the last one. He'd read it once, years ago. It was part of a creepy park ranger story about a national park in Washington, where a non-existent hotel door had appeared during a storm. A ranger had stepped through, never returned. The staircase ended at a massive rusted door. The plaque read, "Archive room guests only." He hesitated, but something moved behind him, clicking footsteps. So he entered. Inside was a cathedral-sized room of filing cabinets. No lights, only glow from bioluminescent moss along the floorboards. Michael wandered the aisles, cabinet after cabinet, drawer after drawer, each labeled with story categories: creepy outdoors stories, scary woods stories, true creepy stories, wilderness stories, outdoors stories, stories from Reddit, park ranger stories. He opened a drawer marked Reddit. Inside were thousands of pages printed, Reddit threads, screenshots, usernames scrawled in red ink, some crossed out. He saw one titled "Room 6 isn't just a room, it's a receiver," posted 6 years ago by someone named M. Grant. He dropped the page, shaking. He hadn't written that. At least, he didn't remember doing so. Then he saw the final drawer, labeled "Pending Guests." He opened it, only one file, Michael's. Inside a page that read, "Entry Room 6, status incomplete, memory leaking roll, curator in progress, duration irrelevant." Then below it, "Final access point, Redwood Clearing, Oregon." He blinked. Suddenly, he was in the forest again, back in the real world. Trees loomed, wind moved, but it didn't feel like home. Something followed, he could feel it. Like a version of Room 6 had grafted itself onto the woods. He wandered toward what looked like a ranger station. It was empty, dusty. The logs inside were scattered, but one entry stood out. It read, "A man showed up confused. Said he had a key to a room we don't have. Left before we could stop him. Left behind this notebook. It only contains his name and a question. What happens when the hotel forgets us back?" Michael collapsed onto a cot. Exhausted, he slept. But the dream was worse. He was back in Room 6. Except now, it had no walls, just infinite doors. Each door marked with a different true horror story he'd once read. Each door opened onto a new dimension. Scary stories from Reddit turned real. Creepy outdoors. Stories that led to nowhere. Park ranger stories where rangers whispered to trees that whispered back. National park stories about trails that rewrote themselves behind your back. And all of them whispered, "You were never a guest. You were always a part of the building." He woke up screaming. The ranger station had changed. All the maps now pointed to a non-existent trailhead called Room 6 Pathway. His boots were wet, even though it hadn't rained. His room key still in his pocket. Still warm, he left the cabin, walked into the woods, and after 20 minutes, he saw it, a door frame, standing alone, with a brass number 6, and behind it, blackness, and something breathing. Michael stepped forward, looked back one last time, but the forest was already gone. The door stood like a wound in the middle of the forest. It didn't belong there, freestanding, unattached to any wall. Its wood was old, peeling. The brass 6 gleamed like it had been polished recently, even though everything else around it was decaying. Michael didn't want to walk through it, but he didn't have a choice. but behind him the trail had already vanished, swallowed by the wilderness. Trees that didn't exist on any map. Silence that stretched too long between bird calls. He stepped through the door, and time stopped. Or moved sideways. He wasn't sure. All he knew was he wasn't in the woods anymore. He was standing in a long hallway, but not like the hotels. This one was made entirely of mirrors, ceiling to floor, wall to wall. Thousands of reflections of himself, each one slightly different, some younger, some older. One had no eyes, another had his mouth stitched shut, but all of them moved independently like they were on a delay, or weren't him at all. He turned around to leave. The door was gone. Only more reflections. One stepped forward. It didn't mirror him. It walked on its own. And it spoke. We're all stories now, some of us creepy stories, some true horror stories, but all forgotten. Michael tried to scream, but nothing came out. The mirrored version smiled. Its teeth were too many. Its voice dropped into a growl. Room 6 is not a room. It's a recursion, a trap for the tales that never end. The mirrors shattered. Glass flew outward, not inward, embedding themselves in the air like they were stuck in time. The floor dropped out beneath Michael, and he fell again. This time he landed on gravel, a dirt path. Trees surrounded him, familiar and unfamiliar. He looked around. He was in a national park. He could hear faint water nearby, maybe a creek. Signs dotted the path ahead, but they were wrong. One read, Visitor Center, Room 8, another trailhead, Room 0, and the final sign, You are here, Room 6, Memory Entry Point. He followed the path. Eventually, he reached a ranger post. The lights were on. Someone sat inside, a woman. She looked up as he entered, and before he could say a word, she said, You're not the first. They call it a creepy park ranger story. But we've lost 7 rangers to that door. Michael stared. She continued. Some call it a glitch, others a ritual. But it always starts with someone opening the wrong room. She handed him a photo. It was of a hiker standing near a motel in Nevada, holding a room key. The face was blurred, but the name tag on the duffel bag said, M. Grant. Michael dropped it. This isn't possible, he said. The ranger nodded. Room 6 loops through wilderness stories, scary woods stories, even old outdoors stories told by people who couldn't explain what they saw. You've entered a structure built on memory, not matter. Suddenly the radio on the desk crackled. A voice broke through. Room 6 has breached containment. Subject is unstable. Begin isolation sequence. The ranger stood up. You need to go, she said. Michael asked, where she pointed toward the forest. Find the lake. If it reflects something wrong, walk into it. Michael ran, through brush, through fog, through whispering trees that seemed to repeat his name. He found the lake, still, black. It showed no stars above, no moon, but it reflected one thing, Room 6, just hovering on the surface, like it was waiting. He walked in, and the world inverted. He stood in a hotel lobby now, silent, empty. Only the receptionist behind the desk. Same woman, same dead eyes. Back again, she asked. This is the 3rd time we've reset you. Michael staggered. What are you? She smiled. We're not who, we're when. Every true creepy story must be told in the right order. You tried to skip ahead. Now Room 6 will tell you properly. He collapsed, woke in a hotel bed. Room 6, door closed, phone ringing. He picked it up. No voice, just purring. Then never opened the door again. He stood, opened the curtains. The view outside was impossible. Not a parking lot, a void filled with blinking eyes. And in the sky, written in stars, you are the story now. Michael could no longer tell if he was dreaming, remembering, or being remembered. The stars outside spelled his name now, not in letters, but in moments. Childhood, breakups, things he had never told anyone. The hotel room felt weightless. The floor didn't resist his footsteps anymore, and the air whispered, not in words, but in questions. Do you know where you are? Do you remember who you were? He stepped into the hallway again. The same hallway, but not. This one flickered between three states. One, a 1960s hotel corridor with green carpet and floral wallpaper. Two, a dirt path through a wilderness trail lined with burnt-out ranger cabins. Three, a blank white tunnel with framed pages on the wall, printed screenshots of stories from Reddit all about people who went missing in rooms that didn't exist. One page caught his eye, true horror stories. What happens after you open room 6? He leaned closer. It was written by him. You don't remember writing this, that's the point. Room 6 takes your story and hands it to someone else. If you're reading this, you're next. A loud tone buzzed through the walls like an emergency siren, but reversed. The lights pulsed red, and the floor under Michael's feet shifted to gravel. Then pine needles, then ash. He was standing in a forest again, but not real forest, one made from scary wood stories he'd read at 2 a.m. on forums he couldn't find twice. The kind of forest where paths loop and trees whisper your worst memories. He moved forward. Shadows darted between trunks, but they didn't move like people. They twitched like ideas trying to manifest. He passed an old wooden sign, Whistlevale Wilderness, Room 6 Trailhead. He froze. That name, Whistlevale, he had seen it before. In an old creepy park ranger story from the 1980s. A ranger who had gone missing after chasing music into the trees. Only his flashlight was ever found. Pinned to a branch above the trail, Michael saw it, a key. Room 6, hung like bait. He didn't take it, but the trail accepted him anyway. He walked for what felt like hours, until he saw the cabin, familiar now, the same ranger station from his earlier vision, but ruined. Windows shattered, walls scratched. Inside, the fireplace burned, though no one was there. And on the table, a guest book. Michael opened it. The names ran down both pages. Most were crossed out, but his was there. Not once, multiple times. Each entry slightly different. Michael Grant checked in Sheraton 33 a.m., never left. Michael Grant saw too much. Michael Grant remembered what he shouldn't. Michael Grant became the hallway. The last entry read, Michael Grant. Still writing this, he dropped the book. The fire went out instantly. Darkness swallowed the cabin. The whispering returned louder now. Every voice said his name. Some sounded like him, some didn't. Then a click, a hotel bell. Ding. He opened his eyes. He was back at the front desk. The receptionist smiled, handing him a new key. Your room is ready again. He looked down. Room 0. He had never seen that before. He didn't argue. He walked. The hallway this time was long, endless. The lights above each flickered on only as he passed them. Behind him, total darkness. Room 0 was at the end. A black door, no knob. As he touched it, it pulsed like a heartbeat. Inside was not a room. It was a library of moments. Each shelf labeled scary stories that shouldn't be retold. True creepy stories that still echo. Let's not meet files. Creepy outdoors stories told by the lost. National park stories you never heard. At the center was a writing desk. On it, a single sentence etched into the wood, "You are the archivist now." Michael sat, and the walls whispered, "Write." So he did. He wrote about room 6, about the hallway, the mirrors, the ranger, the forest that remembered him. He filled thousands of pages, never stopping, never blinking, because if he did, he might forget again. And room 6 would open again. They say sometimes if you walk into the wrong room, in an old motel in Nevada, the bed will already be warm, the mirror won't reflect you, and a notebook will be open on the desk, titled True Horror Stories Guests Who Didn't Come Back, and somewhere inside, a new entry. Yours. Michael didn't know how long he'd been in room 0. He only knew this: he couldn't leave, and he couldn't stop writing. The walls demanded it. Sometimes the desk changed shape, wood became metal, then stone, then something pulsing like a vein. Sometimes he found new paper already filled with words he didn't remember writing. If you see the door, don't open it. This is not a hotel. This is an organism. You are part of its immune system now. He slept in fragments, between memories that weren't his. He remembered being a park ranger in the Rockies, even though he'd never been there. He remembered waking up in a national park cabin surrounded by claw marks and empty boots. He remembered voices whispering through radios. Another subject accessed room 6, send containment. He remembered writing a story once on Reddit under a throwaway account. It got taken down within minutes. But someone replied, "You don't post a memory like that. You return it." He stood. The library now stretched in every direction, shelves taller than buildings, each labeled in true scary stories, wilderness stories, creepy park ranger stories, scary wood stories, stories from Reddit, true stories that remember you. Each shelf pulsed slightly, alive, waiting. He followed the nearest aisle. The further he walked, the more the air changed. Not colder, denser, like time was thicker here. He passed open books whose pages turned on their own. Each one displayed his name, Michael Grant. Some pages showed him screaming, others smiling. One had him sitting at a motel desk, his back turned, a black mass behind him. Caption subject fully integrated. Then the lights went out. A siren wailed in reverse, not a scream, but a vacuum. And from behind a shelf, something moved. Michael turned slowly, a shape vaguely humanoid, tall, stretched, twitching with memory static. It didn't walk, it glitched forward, stuttering between frames of reality. Then it spoke, "What are you doing out of your story?" Michael backed away. The entity followed. Its face shimmered with multiple versions of his own, younger, older, dying. The voice continued, "You were a guest, then you became a witness. Now, you are a librarian." The lights flashed, and Michael saw the truth. Rows of mirrors hidden behind the shelves. Each mirror showed a version of room 6 with new people inside, all living different nightmares. All true horror stories that weren't fiction anymore. One mirror showed a woman trapped in a ranger tower with no way down and something whispering in the storm. Another showed a boy locked in a hotel room where the clock never changed, but his face aged. Michael whispered, "These are all real." The entity nodded. Because they were forgotten. Suddenly, one of the mirrors shattered. Screams erupted from inside the wall. A file dropped at Michael's feet. He opened it. Inside, a Reddit post titled, "What I Found Behind Room 6, a journal entry from 1973. We never built a room 6. A hotel blueprint with 6 scratched in by hand. A sticky note, if you ever meet the receptionist twice, you're looping." Michael ran down the endless hallway. Doors blurred past. Room 3, room 8, room 6, room 6, room 6, room. He slammed into a wall, collapsed, and the receptionist was there. Again, same desk, same smile. "Lost again, Mr. Grant." He gasped, "What is this place?" Her eyes turned black, a maze made of memory, built from all the true creepy stories people ignored. She handed him a match. "Just one. You can burn it down, or light your way out." He took it, lit it. The flame flickered purple, and suddenly, he saw everything, not in order, not even in language, just glimpses. A ranger in Yosemite carving his name into a rock over and over. A child disappearing during a campfire story mid-sentence. A hiker who claimed the forest was breathing. A group of teens live streaming inside a hotel room that didn't show up on GPS. All threads, all real, all tied to room 6, and every one of them tagged wilderness true stories, creepy stories let's not meet. The walls of room 0 began to collapse. The bookshelves folded into themselves. Michael stood in the middle of it all, still holding the match. Then he heard Milo, the cat, from the first story he read on Reddit. The one that started all this. A low growl echoed behind him. He turned. A cat with no eyes sat in the hallway, just watching. Unblinking, Michael dropped the match. The fire didn't burn up. It burned sideways, like a memory being erased. And room 6 started to come apart. Not violently, just unraveling. The mirrors fogged. The whispers stopped. The librarian vanished. And Michael, he opened his eyes in a motel room. Real sunlight, a working clock, the sound of traffic outside. He checked the room number, room 5. He ran to the front desk. A different receptionist. Normal, tired, real. He asked, "Do you have a room 6? She blinked. "No, sir. We only have odd-numbered rooms." Michael left the motel, but as he stepped outside, he saw a car with a bumper sticker. It read, "True Scary Stories Podcast, streaming now," a QR code beside it. Curious, he scanned it. The episode was titled, Room 6, the story that wrote itself, and the narrator's voice, his own. Michael didn't go home. He couldn't, because he wasn't sure it existed anymore, at least not the way he remembered it. The motel was gone by the next morning, bulldozed, they said. Condemned years ago. No room 6, no receptionist, no hallway, just a vacant lot and a broken payphone that rang once when he passed by. He didn't answer. He moved east, took a job at a used bookstore in Maine. Quiet, solitary, no mirrors. He lived above the shop, wrote in notebooks, watched the corners of rooms. They always seemed a little too deep, a little too dark. Sometimes the power flickered at 2:33 a.m. Sometimes the books rearranged themselves. And sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he saw hallways again. Hallways that changed shape, that whispered things like, "The story isn't over, it's just being told again." Then one day he got a letter, no return address, inside a photo of room 6, and in the mirror, him, still sitting at the desk, still writing. He burned the photo. But the next morning another appeared under his door. Same image, different caption. Archivist confirmed. Michael finally understood. He had escaped room 6 physically, but not narratively, because room 6 wasn't a place. It was a pattern, a story loop, an algorithm designed to preserve creepy stories, true horror stories, and scary stories from Reddit that would otherwise vanish. It lived in ranger logs buried under national park files, audio clips on Let's Read, threads flagged, no sleep removed, forest trails that didn't lead back, guest books in hotels that were never built. He began noticing others, people who flinched at mirrored numbers, who twitched when hearing room keys jingle, who never booked even numbered rooms. Once at a library, he saw a woman flipping through a dusty binder titled True Creepy Stories, 1985-1991. On the spine, a brass 6. She looked at him and whispered, "You too." He nodded. He never tried to destroy room 6. You can't. Because every time someone says, "Hey, have you heard that story about the hotel room that doesn't exist?" a new room 6 opens, a new hallway breathes, and a new true story starts writing itself. Now Michael writes. He doesn't know if it helps, but it slows the forgetting. He logs every strange dream, every forest path that loops, every Reddit post that disappears after one upvote. He keeps a key in a drawer, old brass with the number scratched off. And every time someone walks into the shop and asks, "Do you have anything on haunted hotels?" he smiles, hands them a journal, and says, "Just read this, but whatever you do, don't open the door."